Hello, Michelle Goodrick here, yoga instructor and therapist, co-founder of Karmuka Yoga, offering you a fusion of yoga and psychology to help educate yourself so that you can live your life with greater joy, well-being, and energy. So today's topic, we are going to look at yoga and psychology and its connection with trauma. So to begin this topic, first we need to define what exactly trauma is. So according to researchers such as Dr. van der Kolk and Dr. Peter Levine, trauma basically results when we're presented with a circumstance where our capacity to either fight or flight, to run away, has been thwarted. Like we're unable to answer, right, with this kind of response. And as a result, we go into what they term freeze mode, where you become paralyzed. You're unable to respond. So this incapacity to respond, when you go into this freeze kind of paralysis mode, the inability to exercise your own will is fundamental to the development of trauma and resulting diagnoses like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And studies, in fact, have proven that there is a significant difference between the development of PTSD in soldiers who have either been surprised by an attack or by soldiers who have been the attacker, which is interesting because both parties are subject to violence, right? There's still gunfire, there's still death, there's still violence. But the difference is how that violence was experienced. One, so the attacked received the violence and it was unexpected. And this unexpected violence resulted in a greater chance of developing PTSD rather than the soldiers who actually were the ones who did the attacking, who were not surprised by this level of violence that occurred. So just kind of keeping that in mind about the importance of the perception of where that control is, I'm going to go into what actually happens with the frozen state, the state of paralysis that occurs when you are presented with a circumstance where you cannot respond. This kind of frozen state is actually a very merciful chemical invention by Mother Nature. Because what it does is it actually helps to reduce our experience of pain and anxiety. You've probably heard of various accounts of people who have been at war or who've been in a situation of rape or a severe accident, and they report observing the experience completely disconnected from their bodies. They don't actually experience the event physically, okay? Their physical form is experiencing the whole circumstance, whether that be the war, the attack, the accident, but their mind has mercifully been disconnected from that experience. So this disconnection is important to understand because even though in the moment it's a very merciful thing to help reduce the experience of pain, just because the mind might have gone somewhere else doesn't mean that the body did. The body was there and it experienced the whole event. So the stress of trauma, which can be from any kind of shock, it could be from like a bomb going off or to just an unexpected fall or scare, okay? As well as long-term stressors such as an abusive home, a relationship, or even just a really abusive or stressful work environment, stays within the body and the muscle memory. Now, since the mind disconnected itself from the physical trauma, this also means that the job of interpreting the event has also been switched off. And in fact, that seems to be exactly what happens at the level of the brain, that the very points of the brain associated with language seem to go offline. This is important to understand because if you're working with trauma via talk therapy, or drug therapy, this has actually not proven to be very effective in being able to reduce the symptoms of things like PTSD. And Van der Kolk really goes into more detail about this in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, as well as Dr. Peter Levine. So these findings that researchers like Van der Kolk and Levine have discovered make sense, because if the very language centers necessary for language have gone offline, then it would be very difficult to bring those memory neurons back online via just talking, because they weren't even functioning, right, when the event happened. So this is where the power of things like yoga therapy and body work can become very effective in healing and releasing trauma. So the body remembers the trauma because the body never left it, right? This is different from the mind, which kind of disconnects and just becomes this observer. The theory is that the memories of the trauma get stored within the muscle memory and create a kind of feedback loop to the brain. So how does this feedback loop work? So think of it this way. You've had a trauma. Let's say you've tensed up in the neck or shoulders, right? Everybody kind of carries their tension in different places. So we'll just make an example of using neck and shoulder tension that's there and it's tight and it goes all the way up into the jaw, clenching your jaw. So that event that happened with that tension, that memory is still there in the body, right? And so what happens is that tension goes up to the mind. The mind interprets it as stress and then feeds it back to the body as stress, right? So that's this kind of feedback loop, this vicious cycle that you've had this trauma that happened, it created tension in the body, that tension stays in the body. Now that the mind's come back online, it feeds it back to the mind interprets it and then feeds it back to the body to continue this continuous loop of stress and tension. So you have this feedback loop that's continuously feeding back that there's some kind of stressor, some kind of threat nearby, and that you have to constantly be on alert, right? So this might be operating at a really low hum in the background of the mind processing unit, and can result in like feelings of paranoia, of unease, or just a really kind of low hum sense of anxiety, right? And then it may or may not jump up into something that's a lot more intense that can result in a real erratic or even violent behavior. So this is what we often call triggers, right? So there could be a trigger that triggers this memory in the body, and then you respond as a result, even though logically it doesn't make any sense because the trauma is not logical, okay? Now, if you continue to live in this state of high alertness, right, of kind of always sensing and feeling like there's some kind of threat around, the hypothesis is that this can eventually lead to an overall system shutdown, right? You're working at such a high elevated state of awareness that eventually the body goes, I can't do anymore. And then it's hypothesized with some researchers that this then results in depression, okay? Also, another result of trauma is substance abuse and addiction, which is completely and totally logical. It's basically self-medication, right? So if you're constantly living at this high state of alertness and unease, it's completely normal that you're going to try and find some kind of way out of this discomfort and pain that you're constantly experiencing on a daily basis due to this feedback loop of stress. So this is where really getting into the body via things like yoga therapy and releasing that stress stored up in the muscle memory can be a very effective solution to cutting off the feedback loop of stress that is responsible for the aforementioned post-traumatic behaviors. So you might be wondering, how on earth does body work things like yoga and as well as other modalities that work with the body, how are they able to release this trauma that's stored in the body? So it seems to be that by going into the pain rather than avoiding it, a person is able to face the memory that is responsible for this feedback loop, and responsible for the trauma. And facing this memory, this might come out in language, it might come out in tears, it might come out in physical tremblings. That's actually a very common response. Or it might even come out in like screams of anguish, or even just maybe even a repetition of an unfinished fight-flight response. So that maybe you were in the middle of trying to fight off an attacker and you weren't able to complete that. And so as you move into the body work, this desire to be able to move the arm or the hand in a complete way might happen. Now, it's interesting when we discuss the yoga asanas, the postures of yoga, and how moving into these postures can actually be a very effective way of releasing trauma. I'll give you an example of the muscle of the psoas, which is this muscle that moves deep within the pelvis and connects the spine to the femur head of your leg, right? So within modalities like somatic experience, they talk about how this muscle is like the first response to stress. Now, why would that be the first response to stress? Well, it's what's going to be activated to help you run. It's that flight response, okay? So, for example, we could take Virabhadrasana 1. So this is our Warrior 1 pose and this deep lunge, and how if you're doing it correctly, you actually will get deep into that connecting muscle between the femur head and the pelvis up into this iliac psoas, which then connects up to the lumbar spine. It's this lovely connecting loop that works wonderfully to keep us mobile. But if it's constantly in tension due to a traumatic event, it can create all kinds of pain, physical pain to start with. So it could be lumbar issues. It can start, maybe even be responsible for sciatica, just to kind of give you an idea. Or it could even be affecting digestion, because of course all of our digestive organs are in that area as well. And tension in that area is going to also create problems with digestion. And then another example are these great heart openers, these chest openers that yoga does so well. I'm sure you just think about a stressful event and automatically what happens? The shoulders come up, the chest closes in, and we close ourselves in tight, right? It becomes a defense mechanism. So if this defense mechanism of closing yourself up is constantly repeating, if you start to open and release this tension around the sternum area, around the clavicle, and you really start to get your breath into that area of the heart, it's a very common response to feel an emotional response. I've had students who have cried. I've had students who've just want to yawn. There's all kinds of other responses that can come out of that seem illogical in the current present context, but are completely normal and logical if you look at the body as a storehouse of memories. Now, it's also important to remember that there is a threat of re-traumatization, okay? This is the job of the therapist, to watch and observe the client and make sure that they're not going into yet another extremely altered state of mind, of existence, where they're again at a really high state of alertness. There's a place where you play, right? You bring yourself to the point, you feel, you observe the pain, the discomfort, you breathe into it, you observe it, and in that observation and breath, you allow the body to open and release. If there's a point where you are unable to do that, maybe because there's still so much resistance, it is better to wait, take a breath, and then maybe come back to it another day, and another week. So the body's able to start to open itself slowly. We don't want to force the body, right? Anytime we force anything, that is what's resulting in trauma. Finally, in this video on trauma, yoga, and psychology, I want to make a very clear point that the whole purpose of any effective therapy is to bring the autonomy and sovereignty back into the hands of the patient. This corresponds with the previous video that I've done on perception and depression and well-being. So this is the purpose of yoga. It teaches that we are independent and sovereign beings, and that we really suffer when we forget this, okay? We suffer when we start to lay blame upon others for external circumstances or our own discomfort. So this is why releasing the memory of trauma, which is, as we've discussed before, oftentimes more in the body and not so much in the mind, of being the victim, right? Because this is the feedback loop that we get from the trauma that's stuck in the body, is a very important step to remembering that you are the hero of your own life. So via the practices of yoga asana, yoga postures, breath, and meditation, a patient can use this toolbox to be able to start to observe and using their own body and mind as a training ground. They can start to see for themselves. They don't have to believe somebody. They can see and experience for themselves that the only one who really truly controls their experience is them. Now, I've mentioned before, external circumstances are often way out of our control. However, how we choose to respond to these external circumstances is within our capacity. And by releasing the trauma that we might have stored within our body, breaking that feedback loop, we are better able to exercise that capacity of control over our own life experience. By doing this, by moving into this kind of mind-body therapy, we can start to release the sense of helplessness that this trauma might have created within us, which then allows us to move forward with a sense of courageousness, right? So it does take courage to be able to go into these uncomfortable physical sensations and memories. So as you move into these modes of discomfort, this starts to change the perception of helplessness. It allows us to start to perceive for ourselves that we are not the victim of these circumstances, that we have the capacity, we have the power through our breath, through observation, through movement, to be able to release this trauma that has appeared to control our life. So as we release this trauma that has been responsible for subconscious behaviors or behaviors that seem out of our control, we can then go back into what we might call the hero perspective of living. We go back to be able to increase our perceptions of internal control rather than external control, which of course is going to result in higher levels of well-being and greater joy and life satisfaction. So I hope you found that video to be useful and or informative. If you enjoyed it, please give a little like on that button below. If you would like to be informed of any future videos, you can subscribe to the channel and you'll get a nice little ding in your inbox when I get some time to send you out another little video. You can also visit the website at karmukayoga.com to see the online class schedule where you can receive real-time live feedback on your yoga practice from yours truly, as well as keeping updated and informed on any of the online yoga workshops, courses, or in-studio workshops that I'll be offering around the world. You can also schedule a private online session with, again, yours truly. There's all the contact information you need is there on the webpage as well as in the description below this video. I hope you have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world, and that now you can turn this little gadget off and enjoy some real life company of other human beings or animals or just a tree. All the best. Ciao, ciao.